Good. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stanford. Some of you have already been here. For some of you, this is the first time or maybe even the first lecture at Stanford. So I hope you had a good summer and you are well rested and full of energy. What we are doing right now is we are handing out the course handouts. If you don't get it, they will be also at the exit from the lecture hall when the lecture ends. But TAs are handing out the course information sheets, handouts, where you can get information about the course. So to start, my name is Jure Leskovec, and I will be your instructor. I'm an associate professor in computer science department. And this year we are doing something new. What we are doing new this year is that we actually renamed the course, and we will, in a very big part, redesign the course from previous years, where we'll kind of shift the focus a bit from analysis of social networks and analysis of graphs in particular, focus more on predictive modeling of graphs. So we call this course Machine Learning with Graphs. So what I want to do today is I want to first kind of give you a motivation what we are going to do and what we are going to learn this quarter. And then I'll talk about the course logistics, and then we'll kind of start with some basics around graph theory so we all get on the same page. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time. I'll be very happy to answer them. You can also come talk to me after the lecture. If you are auditing the course, you are very welcome to audit and sit in. Everything is good. Okay, so the course. So what we will be doing is we'll be working with graph representations of data. And we will call these graph representations of data, we will call them networks. And networks are a general language for describing complex systems of interacting entities. So the way we can think of this is, if I show you pictorially, rather than thinking our data, our domain that we are interested in is a set of isolated data points or a set of isolated objects, these objects interact with each other, which means that they are connected. So rather than analyzing it as a cloud of data or a cloud of points, we think of it as a network. So a network has a set of nodes, a set of entities, a set of objects, and then a set of relationships or a set of connections that we denote as lines. And that's basically the data we will be talking about throughout this quarter. And of course, these things can be humongous and very interesting and very complex. And it's super rewarding to go look at them and learn what kind of properties of the underlying domain or underlying system they are explaining. I want to first make a kind of a philosophical distinction between how can we think of graphs or networks. We can think of them as networks, as essentially examples of phenomena that appears in real life, and there is a very nice or a very natural representation of that phenomena or that domain in terms of a graph, right? So if you think about, you want to model society of 7 billion people, we are interacting with each other, and we can describe these interactions through the social network or the social graph, and we can start asking what are the properties of the human social graph or the human social network. If you think about trying to analyze the robustness of the internet connectivity, the way you could study that is to study the underlying communication network of let's say, that allows us to communicate across the planet. And if you think about how would you describe how cells in our bodies work or how the life works, it's actually an interaction diagram of different types of molecules that come together to do useful things in the cell. So again, you could take data from the cell, represent it as a network to say, this is how components of the cell have to work together in order for the cell to be alive. And this becomes very interesting because then you can say, if I want to design a drug, I should design a drug so that it changes the underlying network, the underlying machine of how the cell works, right? And especially the same, for example, in neuroscience, if you think about modeling brain is again a network of neurons, right? So if we would like to model thoughts, we have to first map out the networks of how neurons are connected and then start modeling that system. And this is what I will call networks because these are essentially, in some sense, graphs that appear in natural world. So you could call it natural graphs, which is a bit different from what I would call information graphs, where essentially graph representation can be kind of just a way or a heuristic for you to be able to solve a given prediction problem. Right? So while here you are really thinking about how do I model a given domain and what does that network reveal and teach me about the domain, down here we are more interested about what are the relationships between entities so we can do our prediction tasks well. So many times, for example, people would create similarity networks where you have a lot of objects, data points, and you connect the ones that are similar. And that, again, will allow you to better learn over the data because you can learn how to share the data across similar points. And as I think it's already clear, the distinction between these two, will many times be blurred. But essentially, the first goal we'll talk about is how do you take data and how do you represent it as a network, so that you can then learn or analyze it by exploiting the connections between data points. So what are some examples of natural graphs or natural networks? Right? You can think of social networks as very nice natural graphs of who's a friend of whom or who's following whom and things like that. You can think, for example, of the entire World Wide Web as a giant network of how web pages point to each other, where there is now a directed edge between two web pages is one web page hyperlinks the other web page. If you are interested, for example, in the structure of science and how science progresses, then you can start thinking about modeling citation graphs, where basically a paper cites to or refers to prior works. And this is very interesting if you are interested in innovation, if you want to model how science evolves, or if you want to understand how patents get created and how patents cite prior work. So this would be called citation networks. And there's many other examples of networks. Anything from networks in economics, where you can have sets of companies and map out how they relate to each other, to, as I was saying, communication networks. This, for example, is a network of neurons of a little worm. So actually, people dissected the worm to really know what neuron maps to what other neuron. So this is a real neural network, a physical neural network of a little worm. And these are some examples of networks. And one type of question we will be asking in this class are questions about, how are these systems that I have down here, how are they organized? And what are their design principles? Right? You can ask, what are properties of social networks? How do we humans connect and relate to each other? Or you could say, how do I design robust communication networks? And what do they reveal me about the robustness of the internet? Right? Or you can be asking about evolution of science through this representation through the network. So that's one example of kind of domains where our methods will be applicable. So essentially here the idea is that behind each of these kind of complex systems that I gave you an example of, there is a wiring diagram, there is a network that defines the interactions or how these components work and interact together. And if we want to model or predict the behavior of these systems, we first need to understand and map out the networks that govern their behavior. So that's the main motivation. Why are we doing this the way we are doing it? Wow, boy, somebody's having a coffee or something. Good. Now the other thing, which is if you just think about general graphs, what, for example, becomes amazingly useful when you are trying to model data is to represent that domain through some kind of set of relations that are true. So, for example, if you want to reason about how events, this is an example of how you can create a graph of events between flights, what was delayed and what flight went where, and you can create networks like this. You can create what is called knowledge graphs, where you could basically go and encode all the knowledge you have about a given domain. Right? You could say, that Bob is interested in Mona Lisa, that Mona Lisa was created by this other node called Leonardo da Vinci, and so on and so forth. Right? And you can map out this huge graph of basically everything we know about the world around us. And these are called knowledge graphs. You can also think, for example, if you want to do computer vision or image understanding, there's a lot of objects in the image. And these objects are not kind of isolated, that somehow relate to each other. And you can now represent these relationships through a graph. And this would be called scene graphs. And the last example I mentioned is if you think about molecules. Molecules are graphs as well. So state-of-the-art models for predicting properties of molecules are based on the graph representation of those molecules, right? So you can think of these junctions or corners as these are the atoms and these are the bonds. And that's your little graph on a few nodes that you can now try to model and understand. So here the question is, right, how do I take advantage of this relational structure to better model the underlying domain, to better make predictions? So essentially, what I want to say in this case is to say that in complex domains, we have rich relational structure, which can be represented as this type of relational graph. And by explicitly modeling these relationships, we can achieve better models, better performance. We are able to solve tasks better. So this is what I wanted to say about motivation for what we are doing. But you can also say, hey, Jure, but why should I care about these things? So I tell you 2 reasons why you should care. So the first thing is that networks, as you have noticed, are essentially a universal language for describing complex systems, right? I already gave you examples all the way from social science to chemistry to biology to neuroscience and with knowledge graphs, I guess AI as well, right? So the methods we will be working on will be applicable to all these domains because the underlying data representation will be the same. It will be the representation of the network. So this means that there are many different domains from science, nature, technology that are kind of that can be represented as networks, and it becomes interesting to say how are these network representations different, and can we design algorithms that work kind of across all these different networks from different domains. Another thing is that the analysis of networks is a very nice interdisciplinary field where computer science meets social science, physics, economics, statistics, biology, and so on, right? Through this notion of network representations. Another big important thing, why should we worry about these types of data now, is because in some sense, it's finally available, right? We have huge amounts of network data, and there are very interesting and hard computational challenges to solve. And then there is big impact of this technology, right? If you think about the new wave of digital companies, they are all exploiting the graph structure one way or another, right? Why Google became Google as a search engine was that they realized for the first time that web is a graph. Before, they were modeling web search as a set of documents, and Google said, no, this is a set of documents that are connected. And that led to everything there is today. Similarly, if you think about social networks, product graphs, and things like that. So this was at high level that I wanted to kind of motivate what we will be doing. What I want to do in the next few minutes is I want to show you some examples of applications or tasks that you can do with networks, right? So generally, you can think of the way to analyze networks as follows. Right, you can think about trying to model, predict a type of a node. So this would be called node classification. You can think about predicting whether 2 nodes should be connected or not. This is called link prediction. You can think about identifying densely connected or interestingly connected sets of nodes, in some sense, some kind of a clustering task. This is called link detection. And you can also think about measuring and quantifying similarity between different graphs. And this is called network similarity. And for example, where would this be useful is if you want to compare molecules, how similar or different they are. I will show you an example of community detection next in social networks, where you want to identify social circles of a person. I'll show you examples of link prediction for predicting side effects of drugs. And I'll show you some examples of node classification as well. So let me kind of show you some examples what can you do with these types of things. So here's a kind of a very famous picture of the social network of Facebook. It was actually created by one of the students in this class several years ago. He got hired to Facebook later and created this beautiful picture of their network. And one question that you can ask is, how is this network organized? And one way you could try to understand the organization of the network is to say, can I identify the social circles in the network? And you could imagine that every person, right, if this is the person, you take their friends and you say, how does their social network compose of the social circles? And it can become very interesting, right? You could say, here's a set of my friends from high school. Maybe there are some family members up there. But then I've been a few years at Stanford, so I have this very kind of interesting nested structure where, these are maybe my friends from the same university, from Stanford. These are my friends from the same department. And up there in the innermost circle are the friends from the same research group. And for example, here, these two social circles overlap, which means that these two nodes are my two friends from high school who also are attending Stanford, for example. So you can see how these social circles can have very different and complex structure. And the question is, given a network, can I identify these social circles? How well could I do that? And how would I even define the problem if what I want is kind of some organization, how my friends group together? Okay, so that's one example. Another example, it's you can study infrastructure as networks. And here's an example from 2003. This was a big blackout on the East Coast. So this is the satellite picture at 9:29 p.m. East Coast time. And this is the picture 7 hours later. And what you see is that here, you see the lights from the cities. And here you see very little of that light. And essentially what happened was that there was a big kind of power outage across the entire East Coast. And why are networks important? Because you can map the power grid as a graph. And then you can start modeling these types of cascading failures, where failure in one sub-part of the system causes failures in other parts of the system. And then you can start asking, how would I design networks that are robust to failures and don't lead to this kind of cascading failures, right? And we'll learn some laws about what does it mean for the network to be robust and how do we design a robust network. The next thing I want to show is to talk about networks that encode knowledge that we have about a given domain. And the idea here is that these networks can be highly heterogeneous. Heterogeneous in a sense that you can have different types of nodes and different types of relationships, right? So for example, if you wanna, this one up here is kind of a knowledge graph of cars, where you know that Hondas are produced in Japan and they make automobiles, and Japan is an Asian country, and China is also an Asian country, and Toyota is also in Japan, and so on and so forth, right? And you are encoding this into a graph. Or for example, if you are interested about universities, authors, research papers, research conferences, and instantiations of those research conferences, here could be a graph that would allow you to model the relationships between all these different types of entities. And once you have this type of representation, you can learn in very interesting ways. And I'll just give you one example. So in the afternoons, I also work at this company called Pinterest that you may have heard of, right? And what people do there is that they take these types of images and they save them into collections. And what is interesting is that you can take the same image, for example, this one, and you can save it into collections you create that have different names, right? So somebody might be interested in identifying vintage kitchens because maybe they want their kitchen to look vintage, so they would save this into their collection of vintage kitchens, right? Maybe some architect is interested in this kind of bright blue color and the blue accents and how they fit into let's say a kitchen. So they would create another board that would be called blue accents. And so on and so forth, right? And the way you can think of entire Pinterest is that you can think of it as this type of bipartite graph, where on one end you have images, and on the other end you have these collections, and an image can belong to multiple collections at once. And basically, what can you use this now is to say, can I use this representation that I know how these different images fit into different collections to do let's say, pin recommendations, okay? And the way you can do this is to say the following. Let me represent entire Pinterest as a graph. You have about 4 billion nodes here, about 3 billion nodes here, and about 200 billion connections. That's the size of the thing. And then you can say, can I use this notion of embeddings, where the idea is that you will take the graph and you'll try to map every node of the graph in some d-dimensional space so that the nodes that are related in the graph are also close in this space. And you can also do that, and in this course I will show you how we can do that. So now when you say, once you've done this mapping, you can pick an arbitrary point in this space and say, what are other points around it in this space? And those will be your recommendations. So now I want to show you some examples of these types of recommendations. So what are we doing is, somebody will give us a query image, here it is, and then we can go and say, what are the images that are nearby in this embedding space, right? We will take the graph, where every node of the graph will now become a point in this space. And what we will learn is how to do this mapping. And 5 lectures from now, we'll talk about how to learn these types of mappings. But once you have your data embedded in here, you can ask, who are the nearest neighbors of a given pin, of a given image? So here's an example. This is the image. This is what would happen if you would be only using computer vision features. If you only do the image features, and here is what happens if you do the graph, right? And this is some porcelain doll type thingy, or little statue, and you see these are the nearest neighbors in the space, and they are all kind of similar porcelain dolls if you are into this type of thing, right? No recommender system application is complete without cats. So I give you a cat example, right? So if you are in the cats with little hats, then, right, here is our recommendations, right? You see very cute cats with very cute hats. So again, the graph representation allows you to do this. If you are excited, please don't use Pinterest during the lecture, okay? You can do it after. But these are the things you can do. And this is actually something that is running in production, so you can try it out, right? So that's one example of how you can take something, represent it as a graph, not a social network, and let's say do recommendations. Another place where networks are important is in understanding online media, and in particular social media. So it is very interesting if you say, let me try to understand how these networks polarize around different topics. And you can represent, for example, the network of Twitter or the network of blogs, and try to study how is it organized based on the political opinions and leniency. And it's very interesting, for example, that you find that whenever topics are polarizing, you get this type of two sides that kind of talk a lot each with its own members, but there's very little talking across the two sides. And whenever, this is when the topics are polarizing, and this is when topics are not polarizing. So you can kind of identify topics that polarize by mapping the underlying structure of the network of who's talking to whom. Another example where networks help a lot is to identify misinformation or to identify fake news. And we were working here with Wikipedia. And on Wikipedia, you have articles that are completely fake. That somebody came and wrote, and nothing in there is true. So the way you can really do that is, if you only look at the text, it's very, very hard to do. But if you kind of map out how the article is referring to different entities and different entities across Wikipedia, you can map out how it refers to other parts of Wikipedia. And what you find is that when that kind of hoaxes tend to refer to kind of an incoherent set of entities. And that allows you to distinguish between hoaxes, fake articles, and non-fake articles. Again, this is just at the high level. And when you do that, you can go to Wikipedia and identify fake articles. For example, here is one about a new language, Balboa Creole French, that doesn't exist. And there's actually a story that somebody traveled to this island to study this language, but after they arrived, they realized that language doesn't exist. And if you show this to a human, humans do just a bit better than random, right? So this is you ask, is this article a hoax or not? If you'd be guessing at random, let's say your accuracy would be 50%. If you show it to humans, it's only 66. You can do it by 86, right? By, again, mapping out the network of what are the concepts that this article referred to and how these concepts are related to each other. So again, trying to capture relationships. If you'd like more, here's the link to the paper. But that's the idea. Another thing we'll talk about is, so far I was talking about how to model network structures. What is interesting is that there is also phenomena that spreads over networks. You guys recognize that? Right? That's an example of a spreading phenomena, a little social virus or a network virus that spreads over the social graph. And you can study how this information cascades. For example, this Gangnam Style video, how they spread and how people get adopted and how people get exposed to it, how they learn about it, and how they then, let's say, reshare it. This is one example. Another example you can also study is product adoption, right? There is a lot of products that get adopted kind of virally. Virally in the sense that people invite each other. And one of the most successful products that spread through these types of invitations is LinkedIn. Right, so membership to LinkedIn, the way 80% of the LinkedIn members joined LinkedIn was by somebody explicitly inviting them to join the network. And here is one invitation cascade where the person on the top was the first person. They invited a couple other people at the next level who invited other people at the next level. And you see how this membership of LinkedIn is now kind of cascading through the underlying network. So if you want to create products that get adopted but without advertising, by basically people who use your product invite others, you are interested in this kind of spreading phenomena across networks. So, and of course, we'll talk about this, and we'll even talk about who do you infect with your product so that you get the maximum spreading power and things like that. And then the last thing I want to mention, I want to show you a quick example, is about networks and representations from kind of biomedicine. And in particular, one network that is amazingly powerful is what is called a protein-protein interaction networks, right? So in our bodies, we have close to, basically, we have 20,000 protein coding genes, so there is around 20,000 proteins in our bodies. And these proteins physically come together in our cells to do certain tasks. So what you can do is, if you are a biologist, you can go in the lab and actually measure painstakingly for every pair of proteins, do they come together in the cell physically to do something. And this gives rise to the protein-protein interaction network, right? It has 20,000 nodes. And each of the edges is basically hand measured by one of your colleagues in the lab. It takes about, I don't know, a few months to get one edge out, right? And the possible number of edges is 20,000 squared, right? So, but people are doing this, and this is a very useful network. So let me show you one example how this network can be used for a very real problem, right? So here's the problem. Patients today take many drugs at once, right, to treat, let's say, coexisting or complex diseases. For example, in US, about 50% of the people that are older than 70 take 5 drugs or take more than 5 drugs, right? And there are many patients who take 20 drugs together, all at once, right? And the problem is that drugs can have side effects. And the problem is when people take combinations of drugs, kind of new adverse side effects can emerge that are not just side effects of one drug and side effects of another drug. It's new, due to drug interactions, new side effects can emerge. And of course, you cannot create clinical trials to test every pair of drugs to see what side effects would happen. It would just be too expensive, too huge combinatorial explosion. There's around 5,000 registered drugs in the United States. So the number of pairs you can compute, right? So you cannot do that. So the question would be, could you go and given a pair of drugs, predict what kind of side effects can occur? And to tell you one other thing, the way we learn about these things today is that doctors prescribe medication, if enough patients complains that something is wrong, the doctor will investigate. The doctor will then report this to FDA. If FDA kind of collects enough of these types of reports, they have a spreadsheet where they would add a drug combination and the side effect. So basically, we learn about this by luck or by kind of non-luck, if you see what I mean. Okay? So the question is, could I predict these types of things? Okay? So how are we going to do that? Right? The way we'll do this is we will do this as a link prediction task over a heterogeneous graph. So let me now show you how this will work. Right? I will have two types of nodes. I will have the circles who are my proteins and how proteins interact in the cell. So this you can think of this maps how different protein molecules in the cell come together for the cell to function. And the way drugs work, right? The drugs are triangles, and drugs work so in such a way that they change the behavior of proteins. So drugs target proteins. So for every drug on the market, we actually know what proteins it targets. What proteins kind of behavior does it change, right? So this drug C targets these 4 proteins, okay? And then now we have the PPI network, we have the drugs, now we need to encode side effects. And the way we can encode side effects is kind of as labeled friendships between drugs, right? So this would mean that drug C and M, if taken together, lead to side effect R1. And there's around 1,000 different side effects. So there is about 1,000 different edge types up here. And of course, there can be multiple side effects on each edge. But if we have this graph and this representation, we can now go and formulate this as a link prediction task, where essentially we can say, given a pair of drug, what kind of side effects could we expect to happen? And you can do these types of things. And I will show you one way how this method has been validated is that the model made 10 predictions that it was most certain about. And for 5 out of those 10 predictions, those were new side effects that were validated in the lab later, right? So this gave very high accuracy, even though it's a very hard, in some sense, prediction task, where the prediction is link prediction between different drugs. And when you say, it's not only whether they are connected, but also what type of connection it is. So you need to predict 1,000 different numbers for every edge. So that's what I wanted to say about some examples of what we will do in this class and what we'll be able to achieve. Now I want to switch gears, and I want to talk briefly about the logistics for the course. Are there any questions? Yes.
For the drug example, how does the graph work for more than 2, like not only a pair of drugs?
Great question. So the question was, right now we only did 2 drugs. So we were able to do this kind of link prediction between a pair. As I will show you later, there are graphs and there are what is called hypergraphs. And in hypergraphs, you can have edges that connect more than 2 nodes. So you could represent everything as a hypergraph, and then you could start making predictions over triples of nodes. But computation, if you think about that computationally, it would be more expensive. So here, it was only focused on pairs. Okay, but great point. All right, good, yes, go ahead.
What if instead of explicitly telling about the graph, we let the machine itself figure out the inherent property of the data? As in, so for the previous example, what if I just feed the data that these 2 are the drugs and this is the side effect, without telling any explicit notion of the inherent graph structure? How well does this perform compared to explicitly telling you the notion of graph?
Great question. So the question was, why would I even care about mapping out this graph? Why wouldn't I just feed the data and let the model automatically figure it out? Right? What's the problem with that? The problem is that you don't have enough data. Right? You will never have enough data. You talk to people from Google and they say their main problem is they don't have enough data. Right? Which kind of, right? So you don't have enough data. So why do you do this? You do this because you are in some sense capturing prior knowledge, right? hundreds of years of many years went into identifying and mapping out this network. This network is also given to you, right? So you are essentially exploiting prior knowledge to make the model be efficient with the amount of data you have, right? And if you think about the side effects, we don't have all the side effects. We only know a small number. And you cannot collect more because you'd have to start giving random drugs to people and see what happens to them. And that's kind of ethically and otherwise maybe not the best idea, right? So you want to create the graph.
But what about the social network graph? I think there the data is pretty big. So a problem involving a social network problem, some kind of problem there, do we explicitly need to give the graph or?
Graph provides you information, right? Let me give you some examples and you will see why this is a good idea. Okay? So let me give you some examples later. All right, let me continue and tell you about the class. So for the class, I'll be the instructor, and then we have a great TA team together with Michele, who will be my co-instructor, and he will teach part of the course. The TA team is here. You guys can stand up and wave. Okay, great, they are nicely waving. Super. So one thing I will say that is, I think, very important is we are here to help you learn, right? So we are here to help you learn and kind of, in some sense, learn as much as possible. And the way the class is, yes, in some sense, things will be hard, but we are here to help you. Right, so everyone that is here is committed to help you, to make you learn. We will be holding office hours where you will be able to come and ask us questions. We will be able to, if you are an SCPD student, you'll be able to talk to us remotely. If need be, we can also do and hold office, if there will be interest, hold office hours over the weekend and things like that. So basically what I'm trying to say is we are really here to help you. So you will have to put in energy and work, and we'll help you to achieve things that you don't think you can do today. So it will be kind of a win-win situation. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to give you is the outline for the course. So what will happen is we will have 19 lectures. We have a 10-week quarter, so there will be 19 lectures from the lecture today to the last lecture on December 5. We will have an exam on November 19. This is a Thursday. So the lecture on that Thursday, sorry, that's a Tuesday. The lecture on that Tuesday won't happen, but we will have a 2-hour-long exam in the evening. We will announce the details. The way we will structure the course is we will talk about algorithms for analyzing networks. That's kind of in blue. We'll talk about statistical machine learning on networks. This will be kind of the middle part of the course. And then we will also talk more kind of about applications and lectures focused on the use cases across those applications. So that's kind of the high-level structure. Especially in this part, we will be covering some of the very much kind of state-of-the-art work and papers and research that has only recently been published. But we will make things very accessible. So we'll do our best to explain things to you very clearly. As I said early on, a big parts of the class we are re-engineering, and many lectures will be kind of brand new and taught for the first time. So please give us feedback, and please sometimes things may not be perfect, and have a bit of patience with us. But we really want your feedback because we want to improve this lecture so that next year things are even better. So that's the idea here. Now, in terms of the course logistics, there is the course website, and basically on the course website what we have is we have the readings, which is basically we post the slides before the lecture, and then I usually update them after the lecture. So slides are posted, let's say, half an hour before the lecture, the latest, and after the lecture, based on your questions and feedback, I may quickly update them and repost them so that there will be a new version after the lecture, if needed. Readings, there are research papers published on the website for every topic. This will be very useful for you when you work on the course project. Because for the course project, you want to have a set of related work, a set of research that has already been done on the topic. And this will be a very good kind of starting point to start thinking about the projects. Or if you are more interested about a given topic, these optional readings will be very useful to you. So that's about the website. Please check the website. Slides will be posted there before the class. Then, in terms of communication, as majority of Stanford courses will be using Piazza, please use your Stanford email address to register to Piazza. Please participate and help each other. Please don't post code. Please annotate your questions. Search for answers before you ask. Please help each other answering each other's questions. So that, and what we will do is we'll do our best to monitor Piazza constantly and answer questions as quickly as possible. So usually our average response time is about 20 minutes, and we'll try to keep it that way. But this means we really have to be diligent on our end. But if you help each other, it helps us keep that time even lower. Right? But that means that you guys are not stuck, but you can make progress faster. So please help each other. We will give extra credit for people who answer questions on Piazza well. If you want to reach anyone from the course staff, means me or professor or the TAs, don't email us individually. Always use this mailing list. Right? So whenever you want to communicate with someone that is in the course, don't email them individually. Use the course mailing list. Use this staff mailing list. And we will get the question and we'll be able to respond. We will post course announcements on Piazza, so make sure to check it regularly. So that's about Piazza. About work for the course, we have 3 big parts. We have homeworks. We will have 3 large homeworks. And then we also have a starter homework called Homework 0. So the large homeworks, each one will be worth 10% of the final grade, or 9.6, so that the Homework 0 is worth 1% of the grade. And the idea for Homework 0 is just for you to install the software and spend, I don't know, an hour, and it should be done. So it should be easy. And if Homework 0 is not easy, then please come talk to us. Okay? So Homework 0 is not meant to be rocket science. It's meant to be easy to get you started. Talk to us if it's not like that. Then the exam that will be, as I said, on November 19, will be the other 30% of the grade. And then the course project is a substantial part of your course grade. It's 40% of the course grade. And this will be broken down on the proposal, project milestone. Then there is the final report. And then there will be the poster presentation, which you all will attend to present your posters. And as I said, we will be generous with extra credit for people who go beyond what's expected in terms of Piazza participation, code contribution, data set contributions, identifying issues in the lecture notes, things like that. So, and this will be used if you are at the boundary between the grades to kind of bump you up. Now, about homework and these write-ups. The 3 big homeworks are relatively big, so they take between 10 and 20 hours of work each. And this means that you need to start early, and please plan for that. And these homeworks will be a combination of data analysis, algorithm design, and derivations mathematics. And generally, they will be due on Thursdays at midnight Pacific time. Okay? You will be using Gradescope to submit your homeworks, write-ups, as well as your code. And please read carefully the instructions on how to do this, because we need to be able to grade this. So every answer should start on a separate page and things like that. It's all written on the website. As I said, you need to submit code as well as the write-up, both through the Gradescope. For code, we don't go and run your code, but we take, as I will show you later, the Stanford Honor Code very strictly. So we check code for duplication and plagiarism. I'll talk about that later. And then every student gets 2 late periods for the quarter. And what a late period means is that rather than you handing in something on a Thursday night, you can wait till Monday night to hand it in. Okay, so the late period, and you can take one late period per assignment. And now you can use one late period per assignment. The only place where we don't allow late periods are the final reports. If an entire team wants to be late, every member of the team will be charged one late period. Okay, but you can use this or not, however you like. But basically, we allow you to be 3 days late in some sense, right? Rather than Thursday, you submit on a Monday on 2 of these things that you have to submit. So for the exam, what I wanted to say is on the November 19, we'll have the exam in the evening. Duration will be around 2 hours. It will basically cover the content up and including the lecture on November 14th. And the exam is open book. And basically this will be exercises where you will have to explain solutions and process, do some derivations and things like that. We'll give you examples. One thing I wanted to mention is, especially for people who are at Stanford for the first time, is Stanford Honor Code. So please make sure to read what Stanford Honor Code says. It's basically a document that was written in 1920s, and this university has functioned by the principles of that document since then. So please really make sure to read it. I copied some examples from the webpage describing the honor code, what kind of things are not allowed. The site says that a standard sanction for a first-time offense is 1/4 suspension and 40 hours of community service, right? So these things are quite serious. So what I would say is you are very welcome to work with each other. Every person on the team for, let's say, assignments has to produce the solution by themselves, but you can talk to each other, but you have to acknowledge people that you talk to on your homework, right? And it's very important to acknowledge, because if our plagiarism detection software on homeworks and on code will come with some things, will identify certain plagiarisms, it will be very hard for us to do anything but to give this to the Office of Community Standards, and then really bad things can happen, and nobody wants that. So just please read this, obey it, and everyone's life will be better. Okay? So that's what I wanted to say about honor code. I have a few more things I wanted to say. About course projects, essentially, they can be on many different topics involving networks, anything from empirical analysis to algorithms and machine learning models, scalable algorithms, all the way to theory and mathematics of networks. It is done in groups of up to 3 students. You can also do groups of 1 or 2, and we'll take the size of the group into account. But we would really say that group of 3 is most optimal, because you can kind of help each other and work together, and it's more efficient. Project is an important part of the class. We will help you with the ideas, data, and mentoring, and you can start thinking about this now. Another thing to say, because many of you are taking many different courses that have projects, it's okay to combine projects. Just please be very clear ahead of time that you are also proposing part of the project somewhere else, and say, what will you do for this class? What are you going to do for some other class? Note that we will have a poster session on December 12th from noon to 3 p.m. This is the final exam time for this class. So this means that everyone who's taking this class should be free at this time to attend the poster session. If that's not the case, come talk to us. But our expectation is that everyone will attend the poster session, every team presenting their work. One thing that I'm amazingly excited this year is that we'll actually give you computing infrastructure. So we've been able to talk to Google. So this class is around 300 students. So you can compute how much money is that. But so Google was very generous to us. And basically, we will be able to offer $1,500 of Google Cloud credits for you to do your projects. So this means that you will all have essentially the same hardware at the disposal to do your projects. So we will in some sense democratize that and give access to everyone to be able to use Google Cloud credits to do projects. I think this will be great for you because you will also learn how to use these types of cloud services, how to reserve machines, how to do the analysis. And as industry is moving to the cloud, this will be a very good experience. Note that we are doing this for the first time, and also it's never been done at Stanford at such a scale. So there might be some hiccups. Please work with us and be patient. We don't know what will go wrong, but I'm sure something will. Okay? So, and Michele will give you Google Cloud tutorial on Friday, and please refer to him if you have any questions or any problems. We are here to help you and debug you. So this is something we are extremely excited about. And then course schedule. Here are the weeks. Here are the things that will be that you will have to hand in, and these are the due dates. The only thing that doesn't have where you cannot take a late period is the final project report, which will be due on December 10th at midnight Pacific time. So it means at 23:59 p.m. And then, as I mentioned, poster session. In between, there are the 3 homeworks: project proposal, milestone, and then the final project report. The last thing I want to quickly say is about prerequisites. So our goal is to kind of cover everything from ground up. So in some sense, no single topic will be too hard by itself. But what will might be hard is that we will draw upon and cover many different topics, and we'll draw ideas from many parts of computer science. So it's important to have good background in algorithms and graph theory, probability statistics, and linear algebra, right? So understanding matrices, understanding probabilities, and knowing graph algorithms is a good is a prerequisite. And then in terms of programming, you should be able to write non-trivial programs. What that means in practice, you should have some experience to write this much code. If you have written a program this long, I think you'll be fine. All right? But not font size 32, okay? I know. So 100 lines, something like that. And to bring everyone up to speed, we will hold 2 recitation sessions that will be recorded. One will be about software. We will use this library called Snappy in Python, and we'll tell you about Google Cloud. This will be this coming Friday at 3 p.m. in the Skilling Auditorium. Again, it will be recorded and accessible online. And then we'll do a review of theory in terms of probability, linear algebra, and proof techniques. And this will be then next week on Friday, October 4th, again at 3 p.m. And the TAs will give these lectures. And our goal is kind of to cover things that we expect you to know. Now, given that we'll be working with networks, we will need libraries. The library we'll be using is called Snappy. So it's essentially a piece of software that we are developing in our group. There are 2 versions of it. There is the C++ based core, and then there is a Python front end for it. So essentially, you have something that is very scalable, that has a very scalable C++ backend, but you can still use in Python. And you are, of course, also free to use other tools like NetworkX or others, but we don't support this. We'll be able to debug you in using these tools. For this, we cannot. Okay? So that's what I wanted to say about the class. Did I forget anything? Or any questions? Yeah?
Find examples of previous course projects.
The question is are there examples of previous course projects? Yes, there are. So for every year, if you go to the course website, there should be links to the course websites from previous years. And every year we publish all the course projects. So you can use that to get ideas. And then on the website, you will also see that when we ask you what to write, we give you examples, I think, of 4 different project proposals, project milestones, where we say, this is what we thought was a good project. So you can use prior projects to get ideas, and there are specially selected prior projects on the course website that will show you kind of what do we expect from you for the proposal and so on and so forth. All right? Sounds great. There was something there at the back? Yes.
Do you have documentation for Snappy?
Great. The question is, do we have documentation for Snappy? Yes, of course. So what we did a few years ago is part of one homework, every student in the class wrote documentation for one function. And it was done in 3 days. So it was great. So it's really good documentation. If it's not good, it's not my fault. But there is documentation, yes. Prepared by Stanford students. And it's good. I think it's really good. Okay, so what I want to do in the next last 20 minutes, I want to go and just talk about concepts, vocabulary for talking about graphs so that we are all on the same page. Right, so a network is a collection of objects where some pairs of objects are connected or with links or interact with each other. And what we'll be interested in early on is to think about how do we describe a structure of the network, right? So essentially, I'll have 2 types of things. I will have these objects or entities that I will call nodes, or I will call them vertices. And then I will have interactions between pairs of objects that I will call these interactions links or edges. And nodes I will usually denote as n. The set of edges I will denote as capital E. And then the graph or the network is a graph that has a set of nodes and a set of edges. Right, so that's a graph. And here's an example. Okay? Now, as I mentioned early on, the way we will try to say is when I say network, I will usually use it to refer to a real system. I can take a social network, I can say metabolic network. And graph is a mathematical representation of the network. So I can think of the social graph, knowledge graph, web graph. All right? And I will try to make this distinction as clear as possible, but in many cases, we'll be using the 2 simultaneously. So in some sense, don't get too confused. And as I said before, what is beautiful about networks is this kind of common language that you can go and analyze how actors collaborate with each other. You can go and analyze how different people are related to each other. Or you can go and analyze how molecules go and interact with each other. And the point is that all these different domains, all these cases at the end have the same underlying mathematical representation of 4 nodes and 4 edges, or 4 interactions, right? And what is very important is to choose a proper representation for a given question, right? If I, for example, connect individuals into the network based on whether they work together, I will be defining a professional network, right? If, for example, I would connect people who had sexual relationships with each other, I would be exploring sexual networks. It's a different kind of network, okay? And if I would connect scientific papers that cite each other, I would be studying a citation network, right? So it will be very important in some sense that for the question we have in mind, we choose appropriate network representation, right? So if I'm interested in modeling the spread of diseases, maybe sexually transmitted diseases, this is the network I would want to use. If I want to measure the spread of scientific ideas, I would probably use the citation network, and so on. Okay? So how do you define a network? You need to ask yourself, what are the nodes and what are the edges? And as I said, the choice of proper network representation of a given domain or a problem will basically determine our ability to use networks successfully, right? In a sense that in some cases, this network representation will be unique, unambiguous, and in other cases, like the way to encode network or build the network won't be clear at the beginning. So it will require some intuition and some experimentation, right? And the way we design links will essentially determine the questions we'll be able to study. So what I want to do next is show you some examples or some choices of the network representation, all right? And again, by doing this, I'll be introducing vocabulary and concepts. So you can think about two types of networks. You can think about undirected networks, and you can think about directed networks. And the only difference is that one has arrows on the edges, so edges are directed, and in one case, edges are undirected. So if you think what would be a good example of these types of networks, could be collaborations, right? If we work together, it's not that I work with you, but you don't work with me. So it's kind of a mutual relationship. Or friendships, for example, on the Facebook network are also undirected, right? But if you think about directed cases, you could imagine phone calls, because every phone call has an originator and has a destination. Or if you think about following edges on Twitter, those are naturally directed, right? I follow you, you don't necessarily follow me back, but if you follow me back, then we would have this type of edge in one direction and another edge in the other direction. So directed versus undirected. Then the next concept that is important is this notion of a degree of a node. And degree of a node is simply the number of edges that touch a given node. So for example, node A here has degree 4 because there are 4 edges that touch the node. And this is in undirected graphs, you talk about the degree. In directed graphs, you talk about in degree and out degree, right? So for example, the node C here has in degree of 2 because there are 2 edges pointing to it, and has out degree of 1 because there is 1 edge pointing out of node C. And then, for example, here in these types of, you can also talk about source node and sink nodes. So for example, node G is a source node because there is no other nodes pointing to it. And then you could define a sink node. This is a node with out degree 0. There is no sink node in this graph. Okay, so those are the concept of degree, which is the number of edges a node has. And then, of course, you can define an average degree, which is simply the average over the degrees of the node. And if you think about it, the way the average degree is the total number of edges times 2 divided by the number of nodes. And the reason why that number 2 is up there, because when you count degrees, every edge gets counted twice because every edge has 2 endpoints. That's the reason for that. A very special type of graph is called a complete graph. And a complete graph is a graph where there are all the edges between all the nodes. And if you ask how many edges are possible in a graph of n nodes, the number of possible edges is n choose 2 if the graph is undirected, right? So this would be n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So it's kind of the number of edges is quadratic in the number of nodes. Right? And this would be called, if you have a graph where everyone links to everyone, you have a complete graph. Here's an example. Okay? And now what I wanted to show is another special type of graph that is called a bipartite graph. And this was an example of a graph when I was telling you about the Pinterest use case. And the bipartite graph, the idea is that we have these 2 sides, 2 partitions, left and right, and edges can only cross the partition, right? So the red nodes don't link to each other, green nodes don't link to each other, but edges only go from between red and green. And these types of graphs are useful when you have different types of nodes. So for example, you could connect authors to the papers they have written, or you could connect actors to the movies in which they appeared, or maybe users to the movies they liked, or they rated, or they watched, or maybe recipes to ingredients they contain. You can create networks out of food recipes. It's super fascinating. So this is one way how you could create a network out of the food. And then, as we have defined this notion of a bipartite graph, I also want to define this notion of a folded graph, where the idea is that you take the bipartite graph and you fold it in a sense that you connect two nodes on one side if they share at least one common neighbor. So for example, if you think of this as authors to the papers they write, then the folded network would be a collaboration network, because C and D would be connected because they have co-authored a paper together, right? And this would be now, let's say, a collaboration network. So the way to show this pictorially, here is the bipartite graph. And then here are two examples of the folded networks if I fold to the right partition or if I fold to the left partition. And the point is the following. Why are C and D connected? C and D are connected because they have a neighbor in common, number 5. Or, for example, why A and C are not connected? Because A and C don't have a yellow node in common. But, for example, B and C have a yellow node in common. It's number 5. And then on this side, everything is the same. We connect 6 and 7 because they have a neighbor in common. So there's an edge 6 and 7. Okay? And this is called folded or projected bipartite graph. Okay, good. Good. So now that kind of I showed you these graphs and defined some concepts, next thing is that how do you represent a graph? Right? So far we just drawn circles and lines. But the way you represent the graph, there are two ways to do that. One way to represent it is to represent it as a matrix. And this matrix is called an adjacency matrix. An adjacency matrix is the following object. So essentially, the number of rows and the number of columns equals the number of nodes. And then there is a 1 or a 0 where 1 says that a given pair of nodes is connected. Right? So if nodes I and j are connected, then that entry, that cell of the adjacency matrix is 1, and otherwise that the given entry is 0. Right? So for example, you ask, why is there this one here? So this is the second row, first column. So this would be saying that node number 2 is linking to node number 1. And yes, it is. Right? Or for example, down here, this would say that node number 4 links to node number 1. And there is a link there. Right? And one thing you notice is that if the graph is undirected, then this adjacency matrix is symmetric across the diagonal, right? Because if 1 links to 4, then 4 links to 1 as well, right? So it has to be symmetric. If the graph is directed, then it is not symmetric, right? For example, 2 links to 1, but 1 does not link to 2, right? So 1 does not link to 2, but 2 links to 1. And there's an example up there. Right? So one way how I can represent graphs is through these adjacency matrices, as they are called. And the way now you can think of adjacency matrices, for example, if I want to compute the degree of a given node, I simply ask how many non-zero elements are in a given column or in a given row. Right? So if I say what's the degree of node 2, I can sum down the column number 2, and I would get 2, and really the node number 2 really has degree 2, right? And the same thing then kind of happens for directed graphs, where out degrees are sums over rows, and in degrees are sums over columns, right? So the in degree of node number 4 should be 1, and here's the edge, right? But for example, out degree of node number 4 should be 2. So here it is, and it is 2. Okay, so that's how I can, for example, compute degrees. One interesting thing is now that you can take a real graph and plot the matrix. The way you plot the matrix is that zeros will be white and ones will be dots. Okay, so here's a graph. Right, so this is a graph with, I don't know, several thousand nodes. And then every dot means that this particular node links to that particular node, and if there's an empty spot, this means that this particular set of nodes doesn't link to that particular set of nodes, right? So this is a graph. These are types of things we will be studying in this class, right? So this is just a different representation of a graph. This is now the adjacency matrix representation. There's another representation of graph where you can basically think of it as where you represent a graph as a set of edges. And this now defines the graph, right? So for the graph on the right, here is the edge list representation for the graph. Right, so we talked about adjacency matrix, we talked about the edge list, and really what is the preferred graph representation that most kind of software libraries use is what is called an adjacency list, where for every node you store what are the neighbors or what are other nodes that that node links to. So essentially you have a vector or a list for every node of its neighbors, right? And this allows you to work with very large graphs. Now I want to show you the first interesting property of graphs. So here are some examples. So I have different networks like the web graph between Stanford and Berkeley, social network of LinkedIn, some, let's say, communication networks, co-authorship graphs, graphs of the internet, the road network of California, and some protein interaction graph. And then this is the number of nodes, right? Like here is 240 million nodes, for example, and this is the average degree. This is the average number of connections a node has. And one thing that is already quite surprising that follows is that regardless of how big these networks are, these average degrees are relatively tiny, right? So for example, here in this network, this is a Microsoft Instant Messenger network. Think of it as a WhatsApp type chat. You have 240 million people, but on average, every person only talks to 11 of them, right? Or in other cases as well. So the point is that in principle, every node could talk to 240 million others, but at the end, it only talks to 11. So the point is that these networks are amazingly sparse, in a sense that the average degree is much, much smaller than the maximum possible degree. And what this means is that these adjacency matrices will be amazingly sparse, right? That, for example, 10 to the 8 entries, fraction of entries will be set to 0, right? So to show you an example, right, I gave you this example, right? And this looks super empty, but this is actually quite dense, right? In the cases I gave you, you have, I don't know, several million rows and several million columns, and then, you know, you have several million non-zeros. So majority of this matrix is just empty. And that's why we generally never represent graphs as matrices, because it would take too much, or at least not as dense matrices, because it takes too much memory. Okay? So this is what the first point I wanted to make here is that real networks are very sparse, right? That average degree are very low. Even in protein interaction networks, an average protein interacts with 2 other proteins, even though it could interact with 1,800 other proteins, because there is so many in the network. So this was about just choosing nodes and edges. Of course, you can attach a lot of data to the network. And in particular, you can attach a lot of data to the edges. You can attach weight to the edge and make weighted networks. You can attach type to the edge or rank to the edge, saying, oh, this is the best friend, this is the second best friend. You can have different types of edges, saying these are relatives, these are coworkers, and so on. You could even think of edges as being signed so that they can be positive or negative. So you could say, you are my friend, or you are my foe, or I trust you versus I don't trust you. And these are kind of the opposites. This will, and of course you could further label edges based on some structural properties from the network. For example, saying how many common friends do we have, and things like that, right? And then how do you encode these attributes? One way to encode them is to say, if I had an unweighted graph where entries of my adjacency matrix were only 0 and 1, now my entries would correspond to weights, right? So this would mean that edge 1 to 2 has a weight of 2, and the edge between 2 and 4 has a weight of 4, for example. So you can put real valued weights to these things. And then, just kind of to continue, there are two other important types of graphs. So these loops, that basically edges that link to the node itself, these are called self loops or self edges. And these are essentially non-zero entries on the diagonal, right? So this says that node number 1 links to node number 1. And that's why I have that loop up there. And then nobody says you can only have one edge between a pair of nodes. You can have multiple edges. And then you call these objects, you call them multigraphs, because you allow for multiple edges, different types of edges between a pair of nodes. So this would be called a multigraph. So now that we have kind of defined what the graphs are, I want to show you two more examples to think about the connectivity of graphs. And what do I mean by that? I would say that a graph is connected if there is a path between any pair of nodes in the graph, right? So this is a connected graph, while this graph is not connected, right? There is no way to get from H to F by traversing edges. So this would be a graph that is not connected. And then usually these groups, these components of connected nodes, I will call them connected components. And the largest component I will generally call the giant component. Okay, that's why it's called, and it's actually, it's actually a real term, so it means something, and I will tell you what it means later. Okay, so now if I define this notion of connected graph and the graph that's not connected, then how would you see whether graph is connected? One way to see is that you would look, for example, at the structure of the adjacency matrix, right? And if the adjacency matrix has this type of block diagonal structure, this means that these nodes here connect to each other. These nodes here connect to each other, but there's no nodes that, no edges between the red nodes and the blue nodes. And this is how connectivity would manifest itself in the adjacency matrix, right? For example, here, this graph is connected, and this yellow edge here is denoted here, right? And if I wouldn't have it, then I would have these two blocks, and this graph would be disconnected. So this is how you can kind of read off from the adjacency matrix whether the graph is connected. And then this was for undirected graphs. So I just want to tell you, I think this is the last thing, what happens with directed graphs. In directed graphs, you have two notions of connectivity. You have strong connectivity and weak connectivity. And weak connectivity basically says a graph is weakly connected if its undirected version is connected. So I ignore edge directions. And in the notion of strong connectivity, the idea is that there is a directed path between every pair of nodes. So for example, this graph here is weakly connected, but it's not strongly connected. Why wouldn't it be strongly connected? Because there is no way to get from node D to node E by following edge directions, right? I cannot navigate this way. I can go that way, but I don't know how to get back. So this graph is not strongly connected. And you can take a graph and decompose it into strongly connected components, right? So here I have examples of two graphs, and I will now show you examples of strongly connected components. And a strongly connected component is a set of nodes where any node can visit each other, right? So, for example, this is a strongly connected component. Here, this is a strongly connected component because any node can visit each other because they're on the cycle. But these nodes here are not part of the strongly connected component, right? And I think I have a bug here, if you noticed. This, right? So why is here a bug? Because there is no way to get from F to E, for example, right? So if this would be a cycle, this would be a strongly connected component. But right now, it's not, so that's a mistake. Okay. So this is what I wanted to cover today. So basically, I told you about motivation and examples of applications. I talked to you about the logistics for the course. And now we are all on the same page so that we have refreshed the examples from graph theory. And thank you for coming, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Yes.